Have you ever looked at a family photo and noticed that someone was missing, not because they weren't there, but because they had been deliberately removed before the camera clicked? Imagine growing up in a mansion with 17 rooms, eating at a table set for 10, yet never appearing on a single government document, never being counted, never being registered as a human being who existed on this earth, no birth certificate, no school enrollment, no medical records, no name in any database anywhere in the world. Now imagine being that child and not finding out until you were 40 years old. This is not a story about poverty or neglect in the traditional sense. This is a story about wealth, control, shame, and the extraordinary power of one man's decision to finally be seen. Stay with me, because by the time this story ends, you will never look at the idea of identity the same way again, and I promise you, the truth of what this family was hiding is something none of us could have predicted. Chapter 1. The boy without a name in the world. The Whitmore estate sat on 42 acres of rolling Tennessee countryside, the kind of land that made strangers slow their cars and stare through the iron gates at the perfectly trimmed hedges and the 3-story colonial house that glowed amber in the evening light. To everyone in Claiborne County, the Whitmore family was the definition of old money, the kind that didn't flash or boast but simply existed in that quiet, permanent way that made everyone around it feel slightly less significant. Richard Whitmore Sr. had inherited the estate from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. And the weight of that inheritance was something Richard carried, not just in his bank account, but in every single decision he made, from the moment he woke up to the moment he pressed his silver cufflinks into his shirt and walked downstairs for his 7 o'clock breakfast. The family had a reputation to maintain, and Richard Sr. believed in that reputation the way other men believed in God. Absolutely, without question, and with a ferocity that could turn terrifying if you pressed it the wrong way. Margaret Whitmore, his wife, was a woman who had been beautiful in her youth and had aged into something more complicated than beauty. She had aged into elegance and silence. She moved through the estate like a ghost who had made peace with her haunting, always present, always composed, always smiling, that particular smile that said she knew things she would never say out loud. She had married Richard at 22 because her own family had needed the alliance, and she had spent the next 4 decades becoming so thoroughly a Whitmore that she had nearly forgotten there had ever been a Margaret before. They had 3 children together. Catherine, the eldest, who had her father's jaw and her mother's eyes, and had gone to Vanderbilt and married a senator's son, and now lived in Nashville in a house almost as large as the one she'd grown up in. Then there was Richard Jr., who everyone called Ricky, who had his father's temper and his mother's capacity for silence, and who ran the Whitmore financial portfolio with a cold efficiency that made his father proud and his employees uneasy. And then there was James. James was the youngest, the quietest, the one who spent most of his childhood reading in the library or walking the back acres of the estate alone, collecting interesting rocks and watching birds through a pair of binoculars he had found in the attic. James was, by every observable measure, a gentle and curious child who asked too many questions and felt things too deeply for his father's comfort. But none of these 3 children were the secret. The secret was a boy named Thomas. Thomas had come into the world on a Tuesday morning in March, nearly 41 years ago. Not in a hospital, but in the small cottage at the back edge of the Whitmore property, the one that had once been used for groundskeeping equipment and had been quietly converted, over the course of several months, into something that resembled a living space. He had been born to a woman named Cecilia, who was 23 years old and had been working as a housekeeper in the Whitmore estate for just over 2 years when something happened that Richard Sr. decided, with the swift and absolute authority that defined every aspect of his life, would never be acknowledged, never be spoken of in public, and never, under any circumstances, be recorded anywhere. Cecilia was not married. She was not from a prominent family. She was the daughter of a mechanic, from a small town in Alabama, and she had come to the Whitmore estate with the good references and a quiet manner that had made her nearly invisible in the daily life of the household, which was, Richard would later reflect with bitter irony, precisely the quality that had made him notice her in the first place. When Cecilia discovered she was pregnant, she had gone to Margaret first, not out of any particular warmth between the two women, but because she was terrified and she had no one else to tell. She had sat in the small chair across from Margaret's writing desk, her hands folded in her lap, and she had said the words as simply as she could, because there was no complicated way to say them. Margaret had not moved for a very long time after hearing them. She had simply sat there, perfectly still, her pen resting in her fingers, her eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance. Then she had set the pen down, stood up, and said, in a voice that was entirely without emotion, that she needed to speak with her husband. What happened in that conversation between Richard and Margaret is something no one outside of that room ever fully learned. But what emerged from it was a decision, and the decision was this: Cecilia would stay. The child would be born on the property. Cecilia would raise the boy in the cottage, which would be made comfortable enough. She would be paid generously, more than she had ever earned, more than she could have reasonably hoped to earn anywhere else. And in exchange for that generosity, Thomas would not be registered. No birth certificate would be filed. No record of any kind would be created. The child would live on the estate, would be provided for, would want for nothing material, and would in every official sense not exist. Richard Sr. had a doctor, a man named Harwell, who had been treating the Whitmore family for years, and who understood that his continued association with the most powerful family in the county depended on a certain flexibility in matters of discretion, who could be trusted to deliver the child and ask no inconvenient questions afterward. And so it was done. Thomas came into the world on a cold Tuesday morning, crying and red-faced and entirely unaware that the first thing his father had decided about him was that he would never officially be born. Growing up in the cottage was, in some ways, a perfectly ordinary childhood. Cecilia was a devoted mother, the kind of mother who read out loud every night and kept the small space fiercely clean and made birthday cakes from scratch and taught her son to be kind to animals and to think before he spoke. She had a small vegetable garden outside the cottage door, and Thomas spent hours in it as a small boy, digging in the dirt with a wooden spoon and asking questions about seeds and roots and the names of things. He was a bright child, remarkably so, the kind of bright that is almost inconvenient because it means the child will eventually ask questions you are not prepared to answer. The estate itself was his entire world for the first several years of his life. He knew the grounds in extraordinary detail, every path through the woods, every gap in the old stone fence at the property's eastern edge, every tree that was good for climbing, and every one that wasn't. He knew the gardener, a quiet older man named Felix, who sometimes let Thomas follow him on his rounds and taught him the names of plants and explained why certain trees needed to be pruned at certain times of year. He knew the kitchen staff, who occasionally slipped him extra pieces of pie when Cecilia wasn't watching. He knew the house itself, not as a home he lived in, but as a landmark he existed alongside, the way you might know a mountain, always present, enormous, beautiful in its way, and not entirely yours. What Thomas did not know for a long time was the reason he never went to school. Cecilia taught him herself, and she was a capable teacher, working through whatever textbooks and workbooks she could obtain without attracting attention, supplementing with library books from the town library where she drove once every 2 weeks in the old pickup truck that had been assigned for her use. She told Thomas when he asked why he didn't go to school with other children that they had a special arrangement, that many families educated their children at home, that there was nothing unusual about it. Thomas accepted this explanation the way children accept most explanations from their mothers, not entirely but sufficiently. He tucked the question away somewhere in the back of his mind, where it stayed for years, growing heavier and more insistent with every passing season. He saw Richard Sr. rarely and briefly. There were moments, perhaps once or twice a year, when the older man would appear at the cottage door in the early evening, and Cecilia would go still in that particular way she had, and she would let him in, and Thomas would be sent to his room. He could hear the low murmur of adult voices through the wall, but could never make out the words. Afterward, Richard would leave without looking at Thomas directly, and Cecilia would be quiet for the rest of the evening, moving around the small kitchen with careful, deliberate motions, her face arranged into a calmness that Thomas, even as a small boy, could tell was not the same as actual calm. Once, when Thomas was perhaps 7 years old, he asked his mother who that man was. Cecilia had paused in the middle of washing dishes, her hands still in the soapy water, and then she had said, in a voice that was very controlled, that he was the man who owned the property. Thomas had thought about this for a moment, and then asked why the man who owned the property near the Ver looked at him. Cecilia had not answered immediately. She had finished washing the glass she was holding, dried it carefully with a dish towel, and set it in the cabinet. Then she had turned around and looked at her son with an expression he would spend the next 30 years trying to fully understand. And she had said, simply, that some people were afraid of the things they had done. Thomas had nodded, as if this made sense, and in a child's way, it had. The other Whitmore children were presences he observed from a careful distance. Catherine was largely absent from the estate. By the time Thomas was old enough to be aware of her, she was already at boarding school, then college, then gone into her own life. Richard Jr. he saw more frequently, though always at a distance, always across the wide lawn or through the library window. Ricky was several years older than Thomas, and had, from what Thomas could observe, all of his father's certainty and very little of his mother's composure. He moved through the estate with a proprietary ease that Thomas noticed and could not name but felt in his chest as something complicated. James was different. James was only 3 years older than Thomas, and of all the family, he was the one who came closest to acknowledging Thomas's existence in a direct and human way. It started when Thomas was 9 and James was 12. James had been walking the back acres of the property alone, which was apparently something he did regularly, and had come across Thomas sitting under an oak tree near the old stone fence reading a book about the solar system. James had stopped and looked at him with an expression of genuine curiosity, the way you look at something unexpected that you find interesting, rather than threatening. He had asked what the book was about. Thomas had held it up so James could see the cover. James had sat down. Uninvited buzz. Tea, not unwelcome, and they had talked for nearly an hour about space and planets and whether there were other civilizations out in the universe, somewhere. The kind of conversation that is only possible between children who have not yet been fully taught which topics are appropriate for which people. After that, James came back, not always, not on any schedule that Thomas could predict, but regularly enough that Thomas began to think of him as something close to a friend, even though he understood, in the wordless way. Children understand the rules of their world, that this friendship existed only in the back acres of the property, away from the house, away from Richard Sr. and Margaret, away from the formal structures of the Whitmore family. James never brought Thomas to the main house. Thomas never asked to go. They met in the middle, in the borderland of the estate, where the manicured grounds gave way to natural woods, and in that space they were simply two boys who found each other's company interesting. It was James who first told Thomas something of what was really going on, though not deliberately and not completely. Thomas was 11 years old, and they had been sitting by the creek that ran through the property's northern edge, and Thomas had asked, with the directness that had always been one of his defining characteristics, why he wasn't allowed to go to town. He had been to town before. He had gone with Cecilia on errands, but always quietly, always quickly, And Cecilia always seemed nervous in town. In a way, she wasn't on the property. James had been quiet for a long moment, throwing small stones into the creek, and then he had said, without looking up, that Thomas should probably ask his mother about that. Something in the way he said it, not evasive exactly, but careful the way you are careful with something fragile. Told Thomas that James knew more than he was saying and had been told not to say it. Thomas asked his mother that night. He was 11 years old, and he sat across from her at the small kitchen table, and he asked why he never went to the doctor, why he wasn't registered for anything, why he had no identification, why when Cecilia paid for things in town, she always paid in cash and never used any card with her name on it when Thomas was with her. He asked all of these questions in a single rush, the way you do when you have been saving them up for a long time and have finally decided that saving them up is more painful than asking. Cecilia had listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she had gone to the cabinet above the refrigerator, the one Thomas had always been told never to reach into because it was where she kept things that were not for him, and she had taken down a small wooden box and set it on the table between them. Inside the box was money, a great deal of money, more than Thomas had ever seen in one place, and a small folder of documents. She had looked at her son for a long time across the kitchen table, and then she had said that there were things she needed to explain to him and that she needed him to understand that everything she had done because she believed it was what was safest for both of them. What she told him that night was incomplete. She told him that the man who owned the estate was his father. She told him that his father had decided before Thomas was born that his existence would cause complications for the family's public life and that those complications had to be avoided. She told him that she had agreed to this arrangement because she had been young and frightened and had no money and no family nearby, and the alternative, raising Thomas entirely alone without the financial support the Whitmores provided, had seemed impossible. The time. She told him that she was sorry. She said the word sorry in the way people say it when they know it is not enough and are saying it anyway because there is nothing else to say. Thomas sat very still through all of this. He was 11 years old, and he was hearing that he had been deliberately erased from the official record of the world, and he did not cry, which would later strike him as strange, that he did not cry in that moment. He asked one question when she had finished. He asked whether his father knew his name. Cecilia had looked at her hands. Then she had said, very quietly, that she believed so. Thomas nodded. He stood up from the table. He walked to his room and he closed the door, and he sat on his bed in the dark for a very long time, staring at the ceiling, feeling something he did not yet have the vocabulary to name, the particular feeling of discovering that you have been considered a problem to be managed rather than a person to be known. He did not speak about it for several days. Then he came back to the kitchen table one morning while Cecilia was making breakfast, and he said that he had a question. She turned from the stove and looked at him with that careful, watchful expression she always had when she knew something important was about to be said. He asked whether he could ever leave. She had told him that he could. She had told him that the money in the box was for exactly that purpose, that she had been saving for years in preparation for the day when he was old enough to go out into the world and build a life that was entirely his own. She told him that his father's arrangement was designed to keep him hidden for as long as he remained on the property, but that once he left, once he was in the world, there was nothing Richard Whitmore Sr. could do to make him invisible. Thomas had listened to this carefully. Then he had asked a question that made Cecilia set down the spatula she was holding and press both hands flat on the kitchen counter for support. He had asked, in a completely steady voice, why she had stayed. Cecilia had not answered for a long time. When she finally turned around, her eyes were bright in a way that Thomas had learned to recognize as the particular brightness that came just before tears she would not allow herself to shed. She said that she had stayed because of him, because leaving would have meant leaving the only place where she knew Thomas was safe, where she knew he was provided for, where the arrangement, as cold and diminishing as it was, guaranteed that her son would at least not be hungry, not be cold, not lack for anything material. She said that she had told herself every year that when he was older, when he was ready, they would go. But the years had passed, and the going had always seemed more dangerous than the staying, and the arrangement had become the walls of a life she had built inside it, and she had not known how to step outside those walls without everything collapsing. Thomas was 11 years old, and he did not fully understand everything, his mother had said, but he understood enough. He understood that they were both imprisoned inside a decision that had been made before he was born, by a man who had decided that the inconvenience of acknowledging a child was greater than the moral weight of erasing one. And he understood, with a clarity that was remarkable in an 11-year-old, and that would remain with him for the next 3 decades, that he was going to spend a very long time figuring out how to exist in a world that had been designed, from the very beginning, not to know he was there. Chapter 2. The day the world finally counted him 30 years passed, in the way that decades passed when you are living inside a secret, slowly and quickly at the same time, with long stretches of ordinary life, punctuated by moments of sudden, sharp clarity about just how extraordinary your situation actually was. Thomas grew up in the cottage, educated by his mother and by the books. He consumed with a ferocity that was almost desperate, as if he understood that knowledge was the one form of power available to someone who officially did not exist. He read everything: history, science, literature, philosophy, economics, and he developed the kind of broad, self-directed intelligence that formal education sometimes suppresses, the kind that makes connections across disciplines and asks the questions that don't appear on any test. At 18, he left the estate for the first time as a free agent. That is, he simply walked through the gate and kept walking, with a bag on his back, and the money from his mother's wooden box folded into a hidden pocket inside his jacket. He went to Nashville. He rented a room from an elderly woman who asked no questions because she needed the cash payment, and he had cash to offer. He found work, first in a restaurant kitchen, then in a construction crew, then, over several years of proving himself in various physical and practical capacities, in a small carpentry business run by a man named Del Hooper, who cared more about whether you could do the work than about your paperwork. The paperwork problem was one that Thomas navigated with extraordinary care and increasing sophistication over the following years. He was not, it turned out, entirely without resources in this area. The world, as it happened, had many people in it who existed in various states of documentation, some by force, some by choice, some by circumstance, and there were communities of knowledge around the edges of official systems that Thomas gradually learned to access. He was not looking to be fraudulent. He was looking, as he would later describe it, to simply become real, to find a way into the official record that was his by right, but had been stolen from him before he could claim it. It took years. There were false starts and legal complexities and moments of profound discouragement. He worked with a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in cases involving people who had fallen through the cracks of official documentation for various reasons, and who had heard enough unusual stories in her career that Thomas's, while remarkable, did not shock her into uselessness. Patricia was small and precise, and wore the same kind of glasses every day, as if she had decided once what kind of glasses she wanted, and saw no reason to revisit the decision. She approached Thomas's case with a methodical thoroughness that he found deeply comforting after decades of operating in the informal margins of everything. The process of obtaining a legal identity as an adult with no birth record is one of the great bureaucratic challenges of American life, and it involves a kind of circular logic that Patricia described with her customary dry precision as the documentation equivalent of being told you need a library card to enter the library. You need a birth certificate to get a social security number. You need a social security number to get an ID. You need an ID to access most of the legal and medical and financial systems that would help you prove you exist. And to get a birth certificate when you have none, you need witnesses, records, affidavits, legal filings, and the kind of patience that is really a form of endurance. Cecilia was his first and most important witness. Cecilia was his first and most important witness. She was 61 years old by this point, and her health had begun the slow decline that would define the last years of her life, and she had agreed, with an emotion that went far beyond agreement, into something like relief, to give a full sworn affidavit attesting to Thomas's birth, the circumstances of it, and the identity of his father. She had kept, it turned out, more documentation than Thomas had known. Notes she had written to herself over the years, records of payments made into accounts, of Kyriakos calls, unquote, a single photograph taken of Thomas on his first birthday that she had kept hidden inside a book she carried with her for 4 decades. These things became the foundation of a legal file. Richard Sr. had died 11 years earlier, of a stroke at the age of 79, having apparently never reconsidered the decision he had made in the first year of Thomas's life. Margaret was 82, still living in the estate, still moving through its rooms with that particular quality of elegant ghostliness, attended now by round-the-clock nursing care and a household staff that had turned over several times since the days when Cecilia had been among their number. Catherine was in Nashville, living the same senator's wife life she had always lived. Ricky controlled the estate's finances and had, from what Thomas could determine, no interest in acknowledging his existence whatsoever. James was different. James, who was now 43, had spent the intervening decades becoming something his father had never intended him to become, a person of genuine moral conscience. He had left the estate at 22 and spent several years working in legal aid in Memphis, then had gone back to school for a law degree, then had built a small practice in Nashville focused on civil rights and immigration cases. He was not famous. He was not wealthy by Whitmore standards. He had, by the act of choosing the work he chose, effectively separated himself from the family's financial orbit, which had caused a rupture with Richard Sr. that had never fully healed before the old man's death. James wore this estrangement with a combination of grief and integrity that Thomas, when he finally saw it, recognized and respected deeply. It was James who reached out first. Thomas had been in Nashville for 12 years, had built himself into someone who existed, a carpenter with a small business, a man with a legal identity still in process, but progressing, a person who had friends and a life, and a small apartment with a kitchen window that looked out over a courtyard where someone had planted a fig tree that Thomas watched change with the seasons. He had not contacted the Whitmore family in all that time, had not tried to, had not wanted to, had stored his feelings about his father and about the decision that had shaped his entire life in a compartment of himself that he kept very carefully locked. And then one evening he came home from work and found a letter slid under his door, and the return address on the envelope was James Whitmore's law firm. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten, and Thomas read it standing up in the hallway because he did not want to sit down before he knew what it said. James had written that he had been trying to find Thomas for 7 years. He had written that he had known, from the time he was a teenager, the broad outlines of what had happened, and that he had spent much of his adult life carrying a shame about it that had not diminished with time. He wrote that he was not asking for forgiveness, that he didn't think he was in a position to ask for that, but that he wanted Thomas to know that he was seen, that his existence was known and acknowledged and mattered, that whatever their father had decided, James had never accepted it. He wrote that Cecilia had, after much persuasion, given him Bama, the APHAM as address. He wrote that he had a lot of things he wanted to say if Thomas was willing to hear them, and that he understood completely if he wasn't. Thomas stood in his hallway for a long time after finishing the letter. Then he folded it carefully along its original creases and placed it back in the envelope and went to his kitchen and put the kettle on, because making tea was the thing he did when he needed to think without his thoughts running away from him. He stood at the kitchen window and watched the fig tree in the courtyard until the kettle boiled. Then he sat down at his kitchen table, a table he had made himself from reclaimed oak, because he was a carpenter, and making things was how he processed what he felt, and he drank his tea and thought about James's letter, and about everything it meant to receive it. He wrote back the following week. His reply was shorter than James's letter and more careful, the carefulness of someone who has learned to protect themselves by limiting what they offer until they understand what it's safe to give. He said he was willing to meet. He named a coffee shop he liked in East Nashville, a place that was small and not too loud, and that made him feel, in some inexplicable way, like himself. They met on a Thursday morning in November. Thomas arrived early and sat at a table near the window and watched the street until he saw a man approach the door who had, around the eyes and in the way he carried his shoulders, something of the boy who had sat beside him under an oak tree and talked about planets. James was 43 and showed it in the way that people show their age when they have worked hard and worried about things that matter and not slept enough. He walked through the door and saw Thomas and stopped moving for a moment, just standing there inside the doorway. And in that stopped moment, Thomas saw something cross James's face that he had not expected to see. Something that looked like recognition, not just of Thomas specifically, but of something deeper. Something that resembled the expression people have when they see a thing they have been hoping for and had begun to doubt would ever appear. James sat down across from him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then James said hello, and Thomas said hello back, and then James laughed, a short, slightly incredulous laugh, and said that he had rehearsed this conversation approximately 40 times in the past month and had already forgotten all of it. Thomas, surprising himself, had smiled at this. He said that perhaps that was better. James had agreed that it probably was. They talked for 3 hours. Not about the past, not immediately. They circled around it the way you circle around a fire that is still very hot, warming yourself at the edges first. They talked about their lives, about the work they each did, about Nashville, about small things, building the kind of ordinary conversational foundation that makes it possible to eventually talk about the things that aren't ordinary at all. Thomas learned that James had 2 children, a daughter and a son, and that he had been married for 15 years to a woman named Anna, who was a pediatric nurse, and who, James said with a kind of quiet pride, was the reason he had become a somewhat better person than he would otherwise have been. Thomas told James about the carpentry business, about Patricia Chen and the legal process that was still grinding forward, about the apartment and the fig tree in the courtyard. Then James said, with a directness that Thomas recognized as a quality they shared despite everything, that he wanted to help, not in a way that tried to compensate for what couldn't be compensated for, not as a transaction or an absolution, but because Thomas was his brother. And Thomas had been wronged in a fundamental and irreversible way, and James had spent 30 years doing nothing about it, and he was not willing to spend any more time doing nothing. Thomas had looked at James across the coffee cups and the crumpled napkins and the remains of the pastries they had eaten without really tasting them, and he had said, and this was the question he had been building toward through all 3 hours of conversation, that he wanted to know why James had done nothing before, not as an accusation, as a genuine question, the kind that only makes sense to ask when you are sitting across from someone in person and can watch their face as they answer. James had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said something that Thomas had thought about every day since. He said that for years he had told himself that there was nothing he could do, that he was a child, then a young man, then someone who had separated himself from the family and had no leverage within it. He said he had told himself these things with great conviction and had for a long time believed them. But he had come to understand, through the work he did, through sitting across from people who had been failed by every system that should have protected them, that these things he had told himself were not entirely true. They were the stories he had needed in order to live with himself. The truth was that speaking up, really speaking up, would have cost him something. His inheritance, his place in the family, his mother's fragile peace, and he had not been willing to pay that cost. He said that he was not proud of this. He said it with the flat, clear-eyed honesty of someone who has done enough self-examination to be done with self-deception. Thomas had listened to all of this. Then he said that he appreciated the honesty and that it was, in its way, easier to hear than an excuse would have been. James had nodded. They ordered more coffee. Outside the window, Nashville went about its business in the gray November light, and inside the coffee shop, two men who had been shaped by the same secret in completely different ways began haltingly and imperfectly the process of becoming brothers. The legal process concluded 15 months later. Patricia Chan called Thomas on a Tuesday afternoon in February, and he was in the middle of fitting cabinet hinges in a client's kitchen in Green Hills, and he stepped outside into the cold air to take the call. She told him, in her characteristic way of delivering information, clearly and without excessive preamble, that the court had issued a ruling and that Thomas Whitmore, born March 14th, 40 years and 10 months ago, in Claiborne County, Tennessee, now legally existed. There was a birth certificate. There was a social security number. There was at last a record. Thomas stood outside in the cold, February air, with the phone in his hand, for a long time after she had finished speaking. He stood there until he could feel his fingers going numb, and then he sat down on the steps of the client's house and pressed his palms flat against the cold concrete steps and breathed. He thought about his mother in the cottage, teaching him to read with textbooks she had ordered carefully so no one would ask questions. He thought about the 7-year-old version of himself, asking why the man who owned the property never looked at him. He thought about James across the coffee table saying the truest thing a person can say about themselves. Not that they had been perfect, but that they had finally stopped running from the truth. He thought about 40 years of census records with his name absent, 40 years of a nation counting its people without counting him, 40 years of existing in all the ways that matter, breathe, without counting him, 40 years of existing in all the ways. NGA, thinking, feeling, loving, building things with his hands, while being officially nowhere. And he thought about what his mother had told him on a night when he was 11 years old, and the world had just become more complicated than he had known it was, that some people were afraid of the things they had done. He thought about his father, who had died without ever acknowledging him, who had chosen the reputation of a family over the personhood of a child, and he tried, with the full force of his adult compassion and the full weight of his lifelong wound, to understand that fear. He could not entirely reach it, but he could see it, and seeing it was different from forgiving it, and different again from being destroyed by it. He went back inside and finished fitting the cabinet hinges because the work was good and the client was waiting, and there was something right about finishing what you started on the day you officially became a person the world could count. That evening, he drove to Cecilia's small house. She had moved out of the cottage years ago, after Richard Sr. died, into a rented house in a modest neighborhood in Murfreesboro that Thomas had helped her find, and he sat with her at her kitchen table, the same way he had sat with her at the cottage kitchen table 30 years earlier, and he told her it was done. Cecilia had taken the news the way she took most things that were large and important, with a stillness that contained multitudes. She had looked at her hands on the table for a moment, and then she had looked at her son, and what Thomas saw in her face in that moment was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. It was not joy exactly, though joy was part of it. It was not relief, though relief was there. It was something older and more complicated, something that looked like a woman setting down a weight she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. It was the expression of someone who has been afraid for 40 years and has just, in this moment, been told that the thing they were afraid of has finally passed. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he let her hold it, and they sat that way for a long time in the kitchen of her small house in Murfreesboro, while the evening darkened the windows and the old clock on the wall marked time with its quiet, indifferent tick. James was the one who told the rest of the family. Thomas had not asked him to do this and had not needed to. James had understood, without being told, that this was his responsibility to carry, that the telling was part of the cost he was finally willing to pay. Catherine received the news in the particular way of someone who processes unexpected information by immediately asking practical questions, as if practicality is a form of shelter. She asked about legal implications, about the estate, about what Thomas wanted. These were not unkind questions. They were the questions of a woman who had learned, over a lifetime in a family where feelings were managed rather than expressed, to approach difficulty sideways. Thomas did not hold this against her. He told James to tell her that he wanted nothing from the estate and nothing from the family in material terms. He wanted only what he already had, his name in the record, his existence acknowledged, the simple and radical fact of being counted. Ricky did not respond. Thomas had not expected him to, and the silence was, in its way, exactly what it was. The sound of a man choosing the same thing his father had chosen, at a smaller scale. Thomas let it be what it was. He had spent enough of his life in proximity to the kind of pride that dresses itself up as principle to know that there is nothing useful to be done with it except to leave it alone. The story became public, gradually, the way stories do now, first in fragments, then more fully, as Thomas made the decision. Slowly and thoughtfully, and over the course of many conversations with Patricia and with James and with Cecilia, and ultimately with himself, that silence was no longer the shelter it had once seemed. He gave a single interview to a journalist he trusted, a woman named Reyes, who wrote for a publication that took its time with things and didn't sensationalize when it wasn't necessary. The piece was long and careful, and contained none of the details that Thomas had decided to keep private and all of the ones he had decided the world had a right to know. The response was larger than he had anticipated, though perhaps it shouldn't have been, because the response was not primarily about wealth or scandal or the particular cruelty of what the Whitmore family had done, though those things were present in it. The response was about something more universal, something that struck a chord in people across different circumstances and backgrounds and life stories. It was about the need to be counted, about the fundamental human requirement of being seen, not just by the people who love you, but by the world you live in, by the official record of your time on earth, about what it does to a person to be told, by the most powerful forces in their life, that their existence is an inconvenience to be managed rather than a fact to be reckoned with. Thomas read many of the responses and was moved by a great number of them. People wrote to him, through the journalist, through Patricia's office, through James, to tell him their own stories of invisibility, of erasure, of being made to feel that their presence in the world required apology or concealment. They wrote from everywhere. From circumstances nothing like his, and some remark, ably similar to his, and what united all of them was the thing Thomas had learned to recognize as the universal wound, the wound of being told you do not fully count. He started a foundation. It was small at first, seed money from his carpentry business savings, supplemented by a contribution from James that was substantial, but not so large as to make Thomas feel owned by it. Focused on helping people navigate the systems of official documentation that prove existence in the modern world. People without birth certificates, without records, without the papers that grant access to health care and education and legal standing. Patricia Chen joined the board, and 2 other lawyers she recommended. and a social worker named Diane, who had been doing this work informally for years and brought with her a network of connections and a knowledge of the specific practical obstacles that was deeper than anything Thomas could have built on his own. At the Foundation's first public event, a small gathering in a community room in East Nashville, nothing elaborate, Thomas gave a speech. He had written it and rewritten it many times, and in the end he had set the written version aside and simply spoken from the place the words actually came from. He talked about the fig tree in his courtyard, about how he had watched it for years change with the seasons, how it had always seemed to him like an act of pure stubbornness and pure optimism, the willingness to put out new leaves every spring, despite the cold, despite the concrete, despite the fact that it was growing in a courtyard of a rented apartment building and not in an orchard somewhere with better soil. He said that there was a particular kind of survival that looks ordinary from the outside but is, when you understand what it cost, an extraordinary act of insistence. The insistence on continuing to grow. The insistence on seeing fruit. The insistence on being, despite every structural message that you were not meant to be in that particular place. He said that he had been that fig tree. He said that every person who had ever been told their existence was an inconvenience, whose name had been kept out of the records, whose identity had been managed or hidden or denied for the convenience of people with more power, every one of those people was that fig tree, stubbornly alive, insistently real, already growing fruit, whether or not anyone had officially recorded that the tree was there. The room was quiet when he finished. Then a woman near the back began to clap, and then everyone else did. And in the sound of that applause, Thomas felt something that was not victory. Victory was too clean a word for what he felt, but something in the vicinity of completion. Not the completion of a story, because stories don't really end, and his was certainly not ending here, but the completion of a chapter. The chapter in which he had been a secret, had been a problem to be solved, had been a name absent from every record and every census and every official accounting of the people alive in this country. That chapter was over. His name was in the record now. He had been born, on paper, on a Tuesday in March, 40 years ago, in Tennessee, to a woman who had loved him with every resource available to her. He had grown up in a cottage on the edge of a property that had never acknowledged him. He had taught himself through books, and through work, and through the kind of hard-won self-knowledge that only comes from having very few illusions to protect. He had walked through a gate at 18 and kept walking. He had found work, and built things, and paid taxes, and loved people, and made a table from reclaimed oak, and watched a fig tree through a kitchen window. He had fought a long, quiet, unglamorous bureaucratic battle to have what every other person in this country receives without thinking about it, the basic official recognition of their existence. And he had won, not easily, not quickly, not without cost, but completely, irrevocably, with his name written in the record in permanent ink. The census, when it came around next, would count him. Thomas Whitmore would be among the people of this country, officially, finally, undeniably, and no one, not even the most powerful family in Claiborne County, Tennessee, would ever be able to make him invisible again.